crisis calls. You are 911 professionals. You are indeed the first responders, in my opinion. If we didn't have you, help wouldn't get to people in the field. So I delineate usually as I'm speaking about first responders on the phone and first responders in the field. We can't have one without the other. You know, the truth of the matter is you don't get to pick and choose the calls that come in. You don't get to schedule phone calls. You pretty much take what's given to you as people dial 911. And the important thing about training in crisis calls is you are such an important entity. You set the tone for the calls and you gather very, very important information. And they very well may include some of the things that may end up resolving the incident. You are a conduit of information. You take information in and you push it out. You take it in and you push it out. You know, we deal with people in crisis in very different circumstances as compared to a clinical person, a psychologist, a counselor, a nurse. Here's the difference. When you take that 911 call from a family member, a friend, or the person that's actually in crisis, the circumstances may very well be very, very different because it is not a controlled environment. This may be a barricaded suspect, a suicidal subject. It could be a family member that's witnessing all these things. It could indeed be a hostage situation. There could be a criminal component, a criminal connection. So at the end of this call, somebody may be going to jail, which is an added element stressor to that crisis call. You see, you do things quite a bit differently than clinical people because they are usually in a controlled environment. People make appointments, they get medication. But when we deal with them, these calls are rapidly evolving events. The persons may have access to weapons. They may be actively harming themselves or others. They may be making threats. They could be making demands. They could have access to alcohol and drugs, which is controlling their behavior. It's not a controlled environment. It's a very, very dangerous situation. So that's why this training is so very important. You are involved in these calls for a variety of reasons. The person in crisis may be the caller themselves, or it could be somebody that's reporting an occurrence. It could be that third party calling in from a hotline even. Or you may be asked by your field responders who are on the scene who can't get somebody to come to the door to call into the crisis site, and now you've been linked with somebody who's in a crisis state of mind and that's not thinking clearly, has access to weapons. Maybe they don't want to go to jail. Maybe they don't want to live. Maybe they just want you to leave. You are a person of authority, whether you realize it or not. Could be for a matter of seconds that you're on the phone, minutes, or hours, but you can make a difference. Now, I said you're a person of authority. You represent authority. Let me be clear on that. You don't have the authority to make some of those decisions, and we will discuss that a little bit later on. I like to use the Bob Ross correlation. Here's a picture of Bob Ross. Everybody knows him. He's got the fluffy hair. He's kind. He talks about happy trees. But here's the correlation, folks. Remember I said you're a conduit of information. Bob Ross, when I used to watch Bob Ross, he would start with a blank canvas. And then he would start telling you the colors he's putting on there. And then he would start painting, and the painting would come alive right in front of you. Blank canvas, trees, mountains, color here, color there. And I would get to a point and I would think, that's a beautiful picture. Don't go any further, Bob. And he'd put something else in there. He'd put a little cabin, or he'd put a bigger tree. And I think he's going to ruin the picture, but you know what? He was adding another dimension to that picture. So this is my Bob Ross correlation. When you take that call, you don't get to pick and choose those calls. You're like Bob Ross. You're painting a picture. You're painting a picture for those responders in the field. And how are you doing it? By gathering information. There's your color. There's your detail. The longer you're on the phone, the more detail your picture has. You're painting a picture. Now, you may not get finished with the picture, but you've started it, and that's so very important. So, what is a crisis state? Let's talk about that. Well, a crisis state is a subject is in crisis state when confronted with a situation perceived to be a threat to his or her emotional, psychological, and physical needs. A crisis state affects the way a subject thinks, feels, and behaves. It's the behavior part that creates problems for us. So let's just stop and think about this for a minute. Everybody in life has coping mechanisms. You have friends, family, things that you like to do, pets, so many things. What crisis state represents is usually a significant loss, a major stressor and stressors where those coping mechanisms have been compromised or have failed. An example might be the loss of a job, being served divorce papers, being served papers for a violation of a VPO. There can be a conglomeration of many things, but usually people are in crisis state whenever the person or things that they relied on the most are taken away from them. So as we look at the definition, let's break it down just a little bit. Perception is reality. I'll say it again. Perception is reality. If I perceive something to be a threat, it is a threat. If I perceive my life is over, in my opinion, it's over. But I'm only getting that perception from my perspective or the angle at which I see something. So you're looking at my situation or listening to my story and you think, your life isn't over. There's always a tomorrow. But I'm not seeing or feeling that. You see, my perspective is a little different. Perception is reality. We get our perception based on our perspective. We could go buy a car today, you and me. I could be at the front of the car and go, beautiful car. I want that car. But you're at the back of the car and you go, wait a minute, Paul. There's a big dent back here. And oh, by the way, have you looked at the tires? You're adding another perspective. In the 911 call center, I've got somebody on the phone and I've called in because the officers can't get somebody to come to the door. And I'm talking to, say, the husband. And he says, oh, everything's just fine. My little girl called 911. And it was just an accident. Thank you for calling back. But your partner just received a call from the wife in the bedroom saying, send the police now. You see, there was a different perspective, and it changed just like that. Perception is reality. We get that based on our perspective. We don't assume things. The more information that we have, the better we are able to assess and get help to them. Perception, perspective, temporary. An element in crisis state is it does not last forever. Time, in my opinion, does not heal old wounds. Time gives us an opportunity to learn how to cope. You see, I could talk about some things that were very, very sensitive in my life, some losses, and I'd probably start to cry. But you know what? I made it through it. It was temporary. So keep that in mind when you're talking to somebody in crisis. They may not recognize that this is temporary because that's their reality. And one of the last elements is, I said, behavior. You can be in crisis all day long, but when it starts to affect the way you think, feel, and behave, that's when people become in contact with law enforcement. emergency responders because it is affecting the behavior. Making threats, they may be suicidal, they may have downed a bunch of pills, they may have a knife, they may have a gun. That's the crisis state that I'm talking about. When we deal with people, it's in the moment, not at the hospital. Your job is so very important. I like to use a coffee cup as an example. Let's just pretend I have a coffee cup in my hand. I'm going to give you another perspective on crisis. Let's say I filled that coffee cup all the way to the top and it is right there on the edge. I decide I want a little more coffee, so I pour a little more in there. It overflows. Not only does it overflow, now I've got a mess on my hands. What caused the coffee cup to overflow? Was it the stuff that was in the cup or was it the drop? It's both. You see, you don't understand the effects of the drop until you understand what filled up the cup. That's the mess that we've got right now in this particular call. So what you're typically getting is the drop, the precipitating event that has caused the crisis. But you see, it wouldn't be such a mess if this wouldn't filled up in the first place. There was no room for anything more. So it's just a different perspective at looking at crisis. You don't understand one without knowing the effects of the other. You got to understand both of them. And it takes time, but you don't always have time. So you do the best you can. Gather as much information as possible. Start with your blank palette. Start painting your picture. Label it, whatever it is, and start filling in the gaps. Conduit of information. So let's take a look at this graphic. It's a stability plank. On this, you see on one end is emotionality or emotions. On the other end, you see rational thinking. And so as the emotions go up, just like a teeter-totter, the rational thinking goes down. So one of the natural elements that we can use to our advantage is try to buy some time, because remember, crisis state doesn't last forever. It's a temporary state. So the longer we're on the phone, naturally, hopefully, the emotions are going to come down and the rational thinking will, in fact, come up. So we use that to our advantage, hopefully. Recognize it for what it is. This person is not always screaming and yelling and mad, suicidal, making threats. Something has happened to create that emotional adrenaline rush and drive the rational thinking down. Buy some time, painting that picture, getting as much information as you can. So how do you do that? Well, we do that by using active listening skills. And we're going to talk about that in the next section.